The tax reforms and cuts to government services in Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill Act hurt average Americans. Independent analyses have concluded that the 1,100-page mega bill signed into law on July 4, 2025, adversely impacts 80% of the population. This includes the 28% of people in low-income groups and the 52% of people in families with moderate incomes. Only the wealthiest 20% of Americans benefit from the bill. The legislation includes the biggest cuts to the social safety net in American history, and this is exacerbating existing inequality. Under the bill, people have lost access to services that are fundamentally important to their well-being. This includes everything from homeless shelters to hospital transport for the chronically ill. Key areas of harm for average Americans under the OBBBA include diminished food security, declining access to health care, tax cuts for the wealthy, increasing national debt, decreasing clean air, and increasing climate change causing greenhouse gas emissions. OBBBA substantially reduces food assistance through its deep cuts to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, or food stamps. Expanded work requirements and altered benefit calculations significantly reduce the number of people eligible for aid. The Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, CBO, staffed by some 275 economists, analysts, and other employees, estimated that nearly 4 million would lose access to SNAP due to the legislation. Proposed cuts to SNAP are roughly $200 to $300 billion over a decade, making it the largest cuts to the program in history. Reductions in SNAP funding will increase food insecurity for families who rely on benefits. OBBBA will deprive millions of health care and shift costs onto states. According to the CBO, the bill cuts Medicaid funding by $700 billion. These cuts will have a major impact on the 100 million Americans that rely on Medicaid. Under OBBBA, many people will not qualify for Medicaid coverage due to new work requirements and stringent eligibility redeterminations. The result is an estimated 11.8 million Americans are going to lose their health insurance coverage, according to the CBO. The Center for American Progress, CAP, estimates up to 15 million could lose health insurance due to combined Medicaid and Affordable Care Act, the ACA, marketplace impacts. The legislation will strain healthcare infrastructure as cuts to Medicaid funding will increase uncompensated care and make healthcare more expensive and increase the burden on hospitals. More expensive healthcare will raise premiums and increase local tax burdens. CAP anticipates that this will result in decreased services and closure of some hospitals, particularly those located in rural settings that rely on Medicaid. Medicaid cuts could also lead to a deterioration in health outcomes and an increase in preventable deaths. OBBBA has important implications for the funding of public education and student loans. The legislation supports private schools and siphons funding away from public schools through an uncapped federal tax credit and the 529 Education Savings Plan. That's because such tax credits and savings plans are more likely to benefit wealthier families. The bill imposes caps for student loans and makes repayment options less flexible. It eliminates several repayment assistance plans and reduces government-supported payments to between 1% and 10% of income for the remaining plan. The lowered borrowing capacity for graduate and professional students may further restrict access to advanced degrees, especially expensive ones like medicine and law. This limits the ability of low and moderate income families to finance advanced degrees. According to a CNBC survey of college students, many feel the changes make grad school or professional school impossible. Some students say that the changes have forced them to cancel plans for further education. OBBBA also allows Pell eligibility for short-term, that is to say 8 to 15-week training programs approved by governors. However, students may be ineligible for Pell if they receive non-federal aid that exceeds the cost of attendance. OBBBA extends the tax cuts from Trump's signature first-term legislation. While most Americans are getting a tax cut, only the wealthiest Americans truly benefit. Everyone else will end up with less when the spending cuts are factored into the equation. According to the Yale Budget Lab, lower-income households will end up worse off when the bill's broader economic effects are considered. At a congressional hearing, Representative Jimmy Gomez said that, as stipulated by the OBBBA, in 2031, the taxes of those earning from $15,000 to $30,000 will go up by 21%. And anyone making less than $15,000 per year will see their taxes go up by almost 75%. Low-income earners, those earning less than $35,000 per year, will get a tax cut of about $160 on average, representing an after-tax income increase of 0.8%. Middle-income earners, $67,000 to $119,000 annually, get roughly $1,840 on average, increasing their after-tax income by 2.4%. Most of the benefits, $235 billion in the OBBBA, go to higher earners. A Tax Policy Center analysis indicates the top 20%, those with annual incomes of at least $217,000 per year, will get a 60% increase. And that's of the $3.75 trillion worth of tax cuts starting in 2026. These earners will see an average tax cut of $12,660, increasing their after-tax income by 3.4%. More than 33% of the tax cuts goes to the top 5%. That is to say, those earning $460,000 or more per year. And the top 0.1% of earners will increase their net incomes by $290,000 each year. Corporations also benefit from tax incentives in the resurrected 2017 legislation that includes provisions for the permanent reinstatement of 100% bonus depreciation for capital investments and immediate expensing for domestic research and experimental expenditures. Independent analysts project OBBBA will add trillions to the national debt. The bill has more tax cuts than spending cuts, which is why it adds to the deficit. The CBO estimates that the bill adds $7 trillion a year in spending and generates about $5 trillion in revenue. Tax cuts and increases in defense and border security spending will grow the national debt even if we exclude inflation and include a $1.5 trillion in cost savings from spending cuts and revenues from tariffs. Estimates of the amount of debt caused by the bill range between $1.7 and $4.1 trillion over 10 years. While Trump and the Republicans are banking on increasing growth to pay for the cuts, many economists think this is very unlikely. The bill will grow the economy between 0.4 and 0.8% over about 3 decades. Even if we take the higher estimate, 0.8%, the increased revenue from economic growth represents less than a quarter, 22%, of the lost revenue from OBBBA tax cuts. While the bill's tax and spending provisions could result in an additional $124 billion in revenue from economic growth, higher interest rates could also increase interest costs by $441 billion. Debt is increasing at a faster rate than income, and the debt-to-GDP ratio is growing at an accelerated pace. We are now running a deficit that is 6.5% of GDP, and the ratio is expected to increase under OBBBA. According to a CAP analysis, the increase in debt since 2000 is due to tax cuts. They estimate that 57% of the debt is due to the Trump tax cuts and the Bush tax cuts, which mostly benefited the wealthy. Now, if you take out COVID spending and spending associated with the recession of 2008 and 2009, 90% of the increases to the debt is due to these tax cuts. The billionaire hedge fund manager Ray Dalio, who researches the rise and fall of economies, warns that OBBBA will cause people to stop buying government debt, and this could cause Treasury debt defaults or restructuring. According to Dalio, OBBBA will increase the debt from an average of about $230,000 per American family to about $425,000 per family over the next decade. Interest and principal payments on the debt will increase from about $10 trillion, $1 trillion in interest, $9 trillion in principal, to about $18 trillion, of which $2 trillion is interest payments. The bill adds to the national debt and does not address the aging baby boomers' funding issues associated with Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. Now, failing to address the debt sets the stage for economic instability, a collapsing bond market, and much more austere spending cuts that will further exacerbate inequality. OBBBA codifies Republican efforts to kill green projects. The head of Trump's EPA, Lee Zeldin, called the legislation a dagger through the heart of a climate change religion. Bloomberg NEF called the bill a nightmare scenario for clean energy proponents. OBBBA passed in large part because of a Senate amendment that accelerates the phase-out of the production tax credit and investment tax credit for wind and solar provided by the Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed by Congress in 2022. Phasing out incentives for solar and wind projects ignores the lawful spending authority appropriated by Congress. Stricter Foreign Entity of Concern, or FEOC, rules restrict or disqualify green projects with more cost-effective foreign supply chains. These rules undermine the financial viability of such projects and make it likely that they will be cancelled. The bill eliminates incentive to build out clean energy on disturbed or contaminated lands. The White House also said it would slow the permitting process for renewables and introduce new tariffs on parts for wind turbines. The net result is a massive decline in projected build-out of new clean power capacity. According to CAP, this reduction of new clean energy project attributed to the OBBBA could be up to 72%. Modeling from the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, suggests clean electricity generation in 2035 could be reduced by more than 820 terawatt-hours compared to a scenario without the bill. An energy innovation analysis estimates that in 2025, policy uncertainty has already caused $14 billion in project cancellations and 10,000 lost jobs in the clean energy sector. CAP estimates 840,000 jobs will be lost by the end of the decade due to reduced investment in renewables. OBBBA will increase energy costs for consumers and businesses. It will also increase climate change-causing emissions. As the deployment of renewables slows, household electricity costs are expected to rise. CAP estimates an average increase of about $110 per year starting in 2026, and by 2035, some states could see much larger increases. A research paper by Jenkins et al. Concludes American households will pay an average of up to $415 more per year for energy in the next decade, while the annual U.S. GHGs are projected to increase by 1 billion tons by 2035. In addition to eliminating support for clean energy, OBBBA also repeals support for home efficiency improvements such as heating and cooling, efficient windows, and energy audits. Under the legislation, homeowners no longer have access to tax credits for installing solar panels and batteries. The bill not only repeals tax credits for electric cars, trucks, and chargers, but it also imposes an annual federal registration fee on electric vehicles, on top of fees that some states already charge EV owners. The withdrawal of support for electric vehicles will slow their uptake and increase the number of fossil fuel-powered vehicles, which will further drive up emissions alongside costs to consumers. The bill would also end tax credits for hydrogen production. The freezing of funds and canceling of contracts contained in the OBBBA effectively ends the U.S. government's support for green technologies. This raises consumer costs and eliminates jobs. It also is antithetical to efforts to rein in costly, well-documented climate impacts like wildfires, storms, and floods. It also deprives the next generation of the vital technological base required to build a sustainable future. The combination of OBBBA's elimination of support for renewable energy and increasing support for fossil fuels will inflate costs and increase both climate change-causing emissions and pollution. The burning of fossil fuels has devastating consequences for human health, and the bill effectively negates the pollution-reducing and life-saving impacts of the Clean Air Act. This means more pollutants such as smog, mercury, lead, and fine particulate matter. Rigorous research recently conducted by AP concludes that increased fossil fuel use under OBBBA would contribute to at least 30,000 additional deaths annually and at $275 billion worth of costs each year. IRENA and others have demonstrated that renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels, so as clean energy capacity declines and fossil fuel use increases, costs will go up. According to Energy Innovation, the increased use of fossil fuels under OBBBA could spike wholesale energy prices by 50% in the next decade. The legislation offers stronger enhanced oil recovery (EOR) incentives in the form of the Q45 tax credit. EOR is a method of injecting CO2 into oil wells to extract more oil, but it does not permanently sequester carbon. More oil extraction means more emissions and more pollutions related to health impacts. OBBBA effectively locks in fossil fuel infrastructure, which costs more and makes people sick. It also raises GHG emissions and risks triggering climate tipping points from which we may not be able to recover. Different provisions in the OBBBA interact to create adverse compound effects. So, for example, the cuts in the bill will result in job losses and lower state tax receipts. Backfilling slashed services will also inflate state budgets. The cascading impacts from the OBBBA's healthcare cuts could make it harder for some people to get the hospital care they need. That's because the bill slashes funding for Medicaid-supported rehab facilities, and this means that people can't be discharged from the hospital, which translates to fewer available beds. Paradoxically, the legislation might also decrease the number of hours worked, and this could in turn reduce government revenue and increase the deficit. Penn Wharton estimates that OBBBA could inadvertently incentivize some lower-income households to reduce their work hours to qualify for Medicaid coverage, and higher-income people may work less to benefit from the bill's tax breaks. Here are 4 additional examples of adverse interactive effects in the OBBBA. Cuts to SNAP increase food insecurity, and according to the Center for Budget and Policy, this will adversely impact both healthcare and education. Cuts to SNAP and Medicaid combine to impact local economies, leading the Commonwealth Fund to project local job losses and lower state revenues, especially in states with large Medicaid and SNAP rolls. Cuts to food assistance programs has a deleterious impact on health, and they could combine to escalate the impact of education cuts. Tighter SNAP eligibility requirements under the OBBBA mean fewer students will qualify for automatic free school meals, and this could put additional financial pressure on public school budgets for nutrition programs. Health cuts combine with education cuts and puts additional strains on school-based health care. Medicare cuts in the legislation will adversely impact school-based healthcare services like nursing and therapists, as well as psychologists. Pre-K education could be disrupted as many early educators rely on Medicaid. If they lose health coverage due to the more stringent eligibility requirements, this could detract from workplace stability in early childhood education. New Social Security requirements in the bill mean that an estimated 4.5 million children will not benefit from the increased child tax credit, according to New America, and this has downstream health and education impacts. When all the provisions in the OBBBA are factored together, 80% of Americans will be negatively affected by the bill. Very small average tax cuts, around $150, SNAP and Medicaid cuts all combine together to make this bill harmful to everyone but the wealthiest 20% of Americans. Taken together, tax cuts and service cuts provide substantial benefits to the richest Americans, while lower income earners pay more or get virtually nothing. Many analyses indicate that the first decile, the bottom 10%, may lose $1,000 to $1,200 annually. The Penn-Wharton budget model found that these people would see their incomes drop by an average of 14.6%. Those earning $17,000 a year or less would see their incomes fall by $820 on average in 2026. Those with incomes between $17,000 and $51,000 would lose $430 in income, or 1.1% on average. The second quintile, bottom 20 to 40%, will see a small net loss or near zero, and this will be exacerbated by reduced access to safety net supports. The third quintile, 40 to 60%, will see a small net gain on paper. Middle-income households, incomes between $51,000 and $93,000, will receive a tax break of $840, or a 1.1% gain in income on average. However, weakening economic employment dynamics alongside diminished healthcare access will reduce the net well-being of these individuals. The fourth quintile, top 60 to 80%, will see moderate net gains from larger tax benefits, and those with little direct reliance on Medicaid or SNAP will benefit. The fifth quintile, the top 20%, will enjoy by far the largest absolute gains, with major windfalls for top earners. The highest earners, those making more than $174,000, would enjoy big income boosts of just over $12,000, or 2.6% on average. For the majority of those who see some tax relief, however, the net effect is regressive when the large cuts to Medicaid, SNAP, and other programs are included. The clear takeaway is that lower income households will lose, while higher income households will gain. Those who can afford it least are the ones who will experience the most pain due to the passage of the OBBBA. The most vulnerable members of society, children, senior citizens, and people with disabilities, will be especially hard hit. The bill gives the Trump administration broad enforcement authority, and according to CAP, this could further reduce oversight. Trump has been accused of sowing chaos to consolidate his power, and this is especially true of his handling of immigration. The tens of billions allocated by OBBBA for border security, detention, and ICE will create what CAP described as a social and economic instability in the affected communities. The bill serves what Stephen Collinson described as Trump's aggressive claims of executive authority and exemplifies the growing power of a president dominating and disrupting this era in the U.S. and abroad. Trump uses executive power more broadly and questionably than any modern president, Collinson wrote, leading him to conclude that OBBBA is yet another way that Trump is working to cement his authority and tighten his power grip on the country. The most substantial tax benefits of the OBBBA are concentrated amongst the wealthiest individuals and corporations. The almost $1 trillion government service spending reductions are financing the tax cuts for the rich, while decreasing the standards of living for average Americans. The bill's support for the fossil fuel industry alongside the abandonment of renewables will result in rising emissions, lost jobs, and an increase in suffering from the effects of air pollution. The individual impacts of OBBBA on food security, healthcare, education, as well as the national debt and energy interact to produce synergistic negative effects. The legislation exacerbates inequality by reducing taxes on the rich and increasing them on the poor. The passage of the bill also deprives many Americans of access to quality education and health care, both of which are primary drivers of inequality. As Democratic Senator Chris Murphy said on NBC's Meet the Press, this legislation represents the biggest transfer of wealth and money from the poor and the middle class to the rich in the history of the country. The trillions of dollars of additional debt created by the bill poses long-term fiscal risks. The economically destabilizing costs of servicing a growing debt could result in much more cuts, less public investment, and future tax increases. Republicans are hoping most won't notice the harm that they are wreaking on average Americans. They're trying to conceal their malfeasance by careful timing, like ensuring that nobody gets kicked off Medicaid until after the November 2026 midterm elections. Similarly, many of the provisions in the bill that benefit low and middle-income Americans will expire in December 2028, after the presidential election. This includes tax-free tips, the increased standard deduction for seniors, and car loan interest deductions. OBBBA's cuts to the safety net, alongside tax cuts for the rich, combine to create a net negative impact for 80% of Americans. These hardships are further compounded by the burgeoning national debt, increasing energy costs, pollution, and climate impacts. The winners of the OBBBA are those in the higher income brackets, and the losers are the low and medium income individuals. In addition to cutting services that millions depend on and transferring wealth to the rich, the legislation further endangers America's democracy by increasing Trump's already immense executive power.